Imagine strolling along the winding, narrow lanes of a medieval village in the morning. Smoke fills the air from tens of thousands of hearths. But there's something else. This scent so strange, so foreign to our 21st century sensibilities, that it brings you to a halt. What you're smelling isn't quite that scent of fresh bread or charred meat we'd anticipate. It's a rich mixture of decaying fish, fermented grain, and the spices so strong they'd strip paint off wood. This is the smell of medieval food, and what our ancestors received to eat for a banquet would probably have the rest of us racing off to the nearest hospital. Today we're going to travel back almost 1,000 years to learn the ghastly truth about what everyone consumed in the Middle Ages, and I can tell you now, when I'm finished with this story, you'll never view your dinner plate quite the same way again. We're in the year 1347, and we're in the hectic market square of London. Lady Margaret, wife of a prosperous merchant, grips her leather pouch tightly as she makes her way through throngs of vendors selling their goods. But this is not our modern farmer's market. The butcher's stand has meat hung out on the open air for days, its surface green with the onset of rot. The fish stand stinks of month-old salted salmon that's been permitted to ferment to the point where it's the consistency of cheese. And that small baker everyone's dashing to. His white bread is gray, loaded with sawdust, chalk, and whatever else cheaper substance he could get his hands on in attempting to dilute his costly wheat flour. This wasn't poverty fare. This was what the wealthy indulged in. The poor, as we shall discover, had it far, far worse. If we are to understand why medieval people ate such horrid foods, first we need to be familiar with their world. There was no refrigeration, and keeping food safe to eat was a question of life or death. And then, most crucially, medieval humans existed in a completely different sensory world than our own. Their taste buds had become used to flavorings that would attack our current sense of taste. Salt was as expensive as its weight in silver, sugar was more expensive than gold, and the line between food and medicine was non-existent. Doctors prescribed diets consisting of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, convinced that keeping these bodily fluids in balance was the key to wellness. A meal was not just food. It was medicine, social capital, and spiritual devotion in a single package. Let us go into Warwick Castle's Great Hall in 1348, where Earl Thomas Beauchamp was throwing a banquet that would make even the most adventurous modern-day foodie shudder with horror. The first course is introduced, a large sculpture the size of a carriage, all of lard and castle shape, presented full of live birds that take flight when cut. This is staging only. The actual feast starts with blancmange. Not the sweet pudding we use the term for today, but a meaty mixture ground from chicken cooked with ground almonds and rice, dyed brilliant blue with costly lapis sauce. The nobility swallow this down with hippocras, wine so filled with cinnamon, ginger, and cloves as seasonings that it really doesn't taste much like liquor at all. But the pièce de résistance, the real crowning glory, is to come. A roasted whole peacock, its skin removed, then reclad in its feathers, and presented with its tail spread wide in all its glory, its beak topped with real gold. But in a peasant hut on the outskirts of the castle walls, the blacksmith family sits around their single wooden bowl for their supper. Their bread is a combination of barley, oats, and what they can scavenge: acorns, chestnuts, and in times of need, ground up bark of trees. They are lucky to be able to afford meat even once a month, and when they do manage to get some, most often it is salted and cured bacon that's as hard as leather. Protein every day is white meats of milk, eggs, and cheese, yet these are also commonly spoiled by today's standards. The ale they consume, even the children, is safer than the water, which can transport sicknesses that will kill within a week. But worst of all, perhaps, is their vegetable diet. They consume plants we now look upon as weeds or even toxic, such as purslane, nettle soup, and dandelion salads, because those wild greens are more nutritious than their cultivated vegetables. The Middle Ages spice trade is the most fascinating story of all. When Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, European merchants lost their spice roads to the east. Preserve is not the complete explanation. It's hiding the flavor of spoiled food. Spices were eaten in amounts large enough to land a contemporary diner in the hospital by medieval indulgers. An average noble feast included sufficient black pepper to shut down a restaurant. sufficient cinnamon to supply a bakery, and saffron necessary to purchase more than a peasant made in a year. They did not sprinkle them generously. They scooped them up in clumps, mixing flavorings so overpowering that they stood balanced on the threshold of hallucination. Some historians have suggested that the enormous amounts of nutmeg ingested by the wealthy had little psychoactive effect. So medieval feasts were more about consuming than drug-like highs. Medieval mealtime was governed by religious dietary restrictions that seem almost laughable today. Christians could not eat any four-legged creatures during Lent, 40 days. But this opened the door to some pretty creative interpretations that would make any contemporary lawyer proud. Beaver was considered a fish because it resided in the water, so beaver tail was a food during Lent. Barnacle geese were fish because medieval folk thought they hatched from barnacles on ships. Strangely enough, even more so, certain monasteries classified puffins as fish because they spent so many hours in water. The most astonishing religious food habit was the medieval method of dealing with blood. Though the eating of blood was otherwise taboo, black pudding, blood sausage, was popular because the blood had been cooked and thus been changed to something other than what it originally was. Such religious ambiguities formed a shadow world of medieval food in which definition overshadowed biology. The Black Death of 1348-1351 killed only 1/3 of Europe's population. It utterly remade what folks ate. As thousands of workers died, wages for remaining survivors rose through the roof, and peasants could suddenly afford to buy foods that had once been luxuries. But along with this social revolution came a shadow. Some of the richest foreign foods were less healthy than peasant fare. As nobles gorged on sugar-sweet subtleties, ornate dessert sculptures, and spice-filled meat, newly prosperous peasants started getting diseases of affluence. Gout, a disease of nobles, came down to common folk. Along with this, certain quite disturbing eating habits have been the byproduct of desperation plague years. Eating clay to fill hungry bellies, fast bread made of ground-up peas and beans, which caused hallucinations. And in ultimate cases, cannibalism masquerading as long pork in markets where no one asked questions. Medieval medicine and cuisine crossed, and the majority of dishes were pharmaceuticals to consume. Physicians prescribed diets for a range of illnesses, and some of the outcomes are more than strange. Treacle was not the sticky syrup now, but a medicinal paste with dozens of ingredients, including viper flesh, used to treat poison. Wealthy patients consumed gold leaf, ground pearls, and powdered narwhal horn, also called unicorn horn, mixed into food. More astonishing still, people in medieval times thought that food cooked with human urine was a particular medicinal benefit, and this was not cult practice, but mainstream medical tradition. Pregnant women were given regimens that consisted of eating their placenta, coupled with dried wine and herbs. These were not desperate remedies. They were the pinnacle of medical cutting-edge medicine, prescribed by the most learned doctors of the time. Medieval preservation techniques strained food to limits that would appall health inspectors nowadays. Garum, adapted from Roman cooking, consisted of fish guts and salt left in the sun for months until they dissolved into a brown, strongly scented paste. This was a luxury and was served atop nearly everything. Cheese was regularly aged in caves for years, where it developed thick, moldy coats that were consumed in addition to the cheese. Meat was cured through high hanging it up in towers where it would rot in part as it dried, with flavors so overpowering that they had to be counterbalanced by huge quantities of spices. Worst of all, perhaps, was the habit of consuming mortified meat that had been intentionally left to start to rot to create certain flavors and textures that medieval taste demanded. Medieval society's social hierarchy literally had an edible shape. Your status in life decided not only what you ate, but how you cooked it, served it, and even painted it. The wealthy consumed white foods, white bread, white cheese, white flesh, chicken, and fish, when white signified purity and divinity. The poor consumed dark foods, black bread, dark ale, and whatever meat they could manage, most often the entrails and offal the wealthy threw away. But the division had also carried over to implements and cooking techniques. Nobles dined off silver spoons, thinking silver would not only identify but repel poison. Peasants dined by hand, or with rough wooden utensils. The rich person's food often was carved into elaborate shapes. pies in the shape of castles, jellies shaped into coats of arms, and roasts topped with gold and silver glazes. Even the process of eating was performative, with specific rituals, seating arrangements, and courses that reinforced social status with every bite. We end this exploration into medieval eating with a disorienting discovery. Our ancestors were not just eating different foods, they were living in a radically different sensory world. What amazed us more than the ingredients and the cooking methods was a feeling of awareness that medieval humans loved foods that would appall us. Their taste buds, conditioned by necessity, religious observance, medicine, and class, had learned the skill of enjoying flavors and textures we can hardly conceive of. And this raises very serious questions for our own food culture. In our hyper-sanitized, chilled, networked world, have we lost something fundamental to the human culture of food? When every meal is predictable, risk-free, and on demand, do we forfeit the adventure, the risk, the communal seriousness that food once represented? Perhaps most striking about medieval food is not what they were eating, but what their food represented, and what our food represents about us. If this culinary trip back in medieval times has earned you some respect for just how different life was for our ancestors, then kindly let us know by commenting below. What surprised you the most about the medieval food culture? Would you ever wish to live in an age when your bread staple could include sawdust, or when spices cost more than gold? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We're going further on some astounding facts about life in medieval times, such as how they did bathe, what they understood about the universe, and why their medicines were more bizarre than their cuisine. Until we meet again, perhaps spend a moment realizing that nicely safe, refrigerated meal you are about to consume, and remembering someone in the past would have thought it utterly miraculous.